Okay, so we're going to begin today's discussion about thinking in terms of our own formulation of ourselves, or rather our own personal identity and communication. How through communication do we develop our personal identities? A couple of things to remember as we get started. The first is that how we define ourselves isn't static. It's not a fixed position. And yet, oftentimes we have a tendency to get into the trap where we view others as static and fixed. Think about this for a moment. Sometime in the 3rd grade, now this is even more especially true in small towns. Let's say, for hypothetically speaking, in the 3rd grade, you had an illness issue where you went to school and your stomach was really upset to the point that you had to consistently raise your hand, ask the teacher to use the restroom. And you would get up and you'd run to the restroom quite frequently during class, to the point that the teacher started to get a little suspicious that you weren't entirely honest and that perhaps you were just trying to run out of the classroom to get all these breaks from class. It's not like some of us haven't tried to do that before, come up with ways to beat the system and not have to, to keep ourselves awake by getting up and walking out, etc. Okay, so the teacher on the 5th or 6th, 7th or 8th time, you raise your hand, you're feeling ill, you need to go to the restroom, the teacher finally denies you your request. You can't go. You have an accident in your clothes. At this point, no matter what the teacher does, do you or do you not now have a reputation? Will people remember an incident like that? Yeah. And isn't it interesting, 20 years later, when you run into people after high school, for instance, that's the 3rd thing perhaps after, how are you? How are you doing? Nice to see you. How are you doing? Do you remember that time? And we have a tendency to put other people into these static positions, and now this person, to many of us, will always be known, for example, as the person who had an accident and their shorts. And perhaps then it becomes that much more difficult for us to open our minds and recognize that they've grown, but our perception of them may not have. And part of understanding ourselves and our self-concept and the communication of such requires us to recognize that we are a dynamic process. We grow, we evolve, we change. And every experience that we have and every communication that we encounter somehow changes us. We are not the same person we were yesterday, maybe even just by a micro measurement, but we certainly are not the same person we were 10 years ago, where we can see the changes as more drastic. So, as we start looking at this and how we recognize and define ourselves, one of the things we need to recognize is that when we define ourselves, our own definition is not static. We can change, and we do change. Our identities are dynamic because through communication and experience we have, and as we interact with others, we change. So what is the self? The self is a multidimensional process of internalizing and acting from social perspectives. Wow, what a technological definition. What does it mean? The self arises in communication and recognizes that we are of multiple dimensions. We have a physical self, we have an emotional self, we have a cognitive self, an interactive self. We have multiple dimensions. And it arises from acting from social perspectives and arises from communication with others. There are two types of communication that we have with others. The first we want to talk about when we talk about others, those two classifications are particular others and generalized others. Now, particular others are people that we know of as unique individuals. Our families. We know these people by name. These are the people that, if you refer back to a previous discussion that we've had, these are the people that fall under the Martin Buber philosophical continuum of the I-you or even the I-thou. These are people we recognize as individuals, specific, and have some contribution to our lives. Particular others contribute to our own self-concept in four ways. Particular others contribute to our own self-concept in four ways. The first one is by direct definition. By direct definition. Direct definition is communication that tells us explicitly who we are by directly labeling us and our behaviors. As we were growing up, people told us what we were. And because we didn't know and didn't have our own identity, what we do is we absorb the perspectives of others around us. Direct definition, when someone tells you, you're smart, you can do this, they're directly defining you as a smart individual. Now, if you had siblings growing up, depending upon who raised you, your guardians of a sort, mother, father, aunt, uncle, grandparents, etc., they may have told you things like, well, you're the smart one, you're the pretty one, you're the athletic one, you're the responsible one, or alternatively, words that might not have been as positive. Whatever those words were, however we were directly defined, we take them in and internalize them and incorporate them into our own self-concept. Direct definition. Particular others. The first way that they help define our definition through communication is direct definition. The second way is reflected appraisal. Reflected appraisals. It's our perception of another's view of us. Our perception of another's view of us. It may not actually be their view of us, but it's our perceived view of their view. Ever try and look at life by looking in a mirror? That's what we're talking about here. I'm trying to evaluate what my perception is of your perception. I already have a lot of room for misinterpretation here, don't I? But it's real, and it's true, and it's real to us as it can possibly get. The idea, for example, of direct definition, you're the smart one, you're the responsible one. Well, what if I've been told by direct definition that I am the responsible one my entire life, and then I turn 18 years old, I graduate school, I get a job, I'm excited because I moved out of the house, I got my own apartment, and with my job I've already even prepared a budget, I've got the budget to pay my bills, and I've already kind of laid out the budget, and I know how much I'm paying in rent, my utilities, and all these other things, and I know how much I'm going to put away, how I'm going to pay for my transportation, whatever it might be, and yet, although by direct definition, I've been told all my life, by my family, you're the responsible one. You're the smart one. And yet, 1 week before all my bills are due, my parents run around town and pay all my bills. Now, some of us might be thinking, yes! More money for me that I get to keep that I earned. I don't have to worry about that budget, I get to pocket the extra cash. When in fact, what does that do to the person who has spent all their time being told something, you're the smart one, you're the responsible one, but now their perception of their parents' behavior provides them with an indication that their parents' perception of them is that they're not quite responsible. They're not quite smart enough to figure this out, and that they still need to be overlooked. You see how that might actually confuse some people and their self-concept deep down? Others would look at it as a gift. This could actually cause problems in others because the consistency isn't necessarily there. Reflected appraisal is the second one. And by reflected appraisal, as opposed to direct definition, I'm actually evaluating my perception of another's perception of me. And that's often indicated through behavior. The third, after direct definition and reflected appraisal, the third contributor to our jigsaw puzzle, if you were, of how we develop our self-concept is identity scripts. Identity scripts. What does it mean to be a member of your family? What does it mean to be a member of the American citizenry? What does it mean to be male? What does it mean to be female? Within our families growing up and our communities, highly contributed to by our culture, we are often told these things quite regularly. What does it mean to be a member of your family? You know, in this family, we are all doctors. I expect every one of my children to grow up and be a doctor just like me. I'm told, and these things are repeated. These are identity scripts. What does it mean to be, a Smith, a Jones? What does it mean to be an American? We are often told that there are constitutional freedoms that we will go out of our way to protect very strongly. And those freedoms help define what it means to be an American. We repeat these things again and again. These are identity scripts. What does it mean to be a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim? We are people of faith, whatever faith that might be. Okay? What does it mean when we start repeating these identity scripts again and again? We internalize them. So it might be something like we are responsible people, or we always help those in need. And when these are repeated, they become scripts for us to pay attention to. A good education is the key to success. When I was growing up, for instance, I was told that education was my highest priority. I had no other. If I wanted a job when I was a teenager, my folks would examine my report card, transcripts, etc., look at my grades to determine whether or not there was room for adding a job in there. Because if the grades weren't where they needed to be, there was no discussion warranted about a job. Now, of course, that's not the same as every family that you would look at, because different families carry different priorities. So what does it mean to be? And these conversations that are repeated again and again become identity scripts for us. You join the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or the 4-H Club, and there are mottos and promises and oaths that we learn. These are identity scripts. What does it mean to be a Boy Scout, a Girl Scout? We can look at the oaths because these are repeated to us, and we repeat them, and we internalize them. Identity scripts. The fourth, after direct definition, reflected appraisal, and identity scripts, the fourth contributing factor to the creation of our self-concept, based on the theories we're talking about today and the discussion we're having today, are attachment styles, of which there are 4 attachment styles we want to pay attention to. But the fourth is attachment styles. The first of those attachment styles that we want to discuss is the secure attachment style. Now, first, what is an attachment style? An attachment style, based on this psychological theory, this discussion, suggests that, follow me on this because I think it's important for us to really get a handle on this concept. It suggests that how we were treated by our primary caregiver, now this is typically our mother, from the time of our birth and through our infancy, has direct bearing on our outlook as adults, on how we see ourselves as well as how we view others, generally speaking. That's heavy. That's heavy. How we were treated and the relationship we had with our primary caregiver from the time of our birth through our infancy has direct bearing on our outlook of how we view ourselves today as adults, as well as how we see others, how we view others, positively or negatively. So the first one we want to discuss is the secure relationship. A secure attachment style is facilitated when the caregiver responds in a consistently attentive and loving way to the child. Consistently attentive and loving way. The child is fed when it needs to be fed. It's changed when it needs to be changed. It's provided with a lot of attention and hugs and touching and things of this nature that children who are going to be healthy and are cared for in a healthy manner is taken care of. As such, the child learns that it can trust and that it is valued. As a result, by the time the child who had a very secure attachment style grows to be an adult, we've developed positive outlooks and positive views of ourselves because we are valued. We recognize that we are valued. And positive outlooks, positive views of others, because others can be trusted, generally speaking, and are also of value in our lives. That's the first. The second attachment style we want to talk about is the fearful attachment style. The fearful attachment style is cultivated when the caregiver in the first bond, the mother, usually the mother, the primary caregiver, is unavailable or communicates in negative, rejecting, or even abusive ways to the child. Unavailable, negative communication, neglectful, or rejecting, or even abusive. Children who are treated this way often infer, by the time that they are adults, that they are unworthy of love. They don't have a foundation, a start in that mode of life. And that others are just not loving individuals by their very nature. As a consequence, we are talking about people who, by the time they become adults, their perspective on themselves is negative. They're unworthy. Their perspective on others is also negative. People are not trustworthy. People are not, by their very nature, loving individuals. Those are the two extremes. So what about the two in the middle, where we kind of drop those in between there? The next one is the dismissive attachment style. This is also promoted by caregivers who are disinterested, rejecting of, or unavailable to children. The disinterest, the dismissive attitude. Perhaps they care one day, perhaps they don't. I mean, it's just like they don't care one way or the other. The child could be very receptive, or the child could be non-receptive to the care that the parent is giving them, and it doesn't make any difference to the parent or the primary caregiver. That being said, if the child is has a very dismissive attachment style from that very bonding formation years from birth through infancy, the child winds up with a very negative view of others. A negative view of others because they're dismissive, right? They don't really matter. And the child begins to realize as an adult that other people don't matter. But they have a positive view of themselves. And let's think about that for a moment. Anything that they've accomplished in their life, who's responsible for it at that point? They are. Kind of the bootstrapping idea, right? I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps. I did it because I put my mind to it, and I put it together because other people cannot be relied upon. And so the perspective on myself is positive. However, I don't have a really positive perspective on other people in general. And finally, the fourth pattern is the anxious/ambivalent, anxious or ambivalent attachment style, which is also referred to as the preoccupied style. Also referred to as the preoccupied style. This is the most complex of the four. It's the most complicated and messy. Each of the other three styles results from a consistent pattern. The anxious ambivalent style, however, what characterizes this is inconsistency. Inconsistency from that primary caregiver. Sometimes the caregiver is loving and attentive, and at other times is indifferent or rejecting. It's not only inconsistent, it's unpredictable. So what does that mean? Well, if you look at the only box left as far as the combination that we have, it means that I've got a very negative view as an adult of myself if I had an anxious and ambivalent attachment style. And I have a very a very positive view of others. Because I see myself as unworthy, I don't make the connection that the inconsistency is the primary caregiver's problem. Somehow I make the connection that it's my issue. I see myself as unworthy. And when the primary caregiver, or others in general, pay attention and do nice things for me, it's because I'm being rewarded because I finally figured it out. I finally figured it out. And so I spend my life trying to figure out what it is I need to do to please others and only gauge my success on others' reaction, and that's unpredictable to begin with. I have a positive view of others, I have a negative view of myself. And that, of those four attachment styles, create the fourth contributory pattern, along with identity scripts, direct definition, and reflected appraisal, to how we might come about at least one conception, formulation of our self-concept. How do we come to creating who we are as a result of particular others? As a result of particular others. The other aspect of that is the generalized other. General others. And who are general others? You know, it's always interesting when people say to me, you know what they say, or you know what they're going to say, or you know what they think. And my response for years was always, who the heck are they? And why do we care? When we talk about the they, we're talking about the generalized other here. When we talk about the they, we're talking about the reflected views generally held by others in society. How in the world could we possibly know that? What others think, generally speaking. These broadly held social views have a tendency to tell us how various concepts are constructed. Various concepts are constructed. For example, how is race constructed? There are some cultures, for example, that don't recognize the concept of race. It's a foreign idea. And yet, in some cultures, we recognize it by various characteristics of lineage, where people came from, with respect to were they born within political borders at the time. We recognize it by skin color, hair color, eye color, race. It's actually a socially constructed concept. You know, it's always funny when people say to me, well, I think that in the United States, only people who started here should be able to stay here, and let's kick everyone out. And I never hear these words from Native American Indians. I hear these words from people who want to classify themselves as the people who started here. And if we go back far enough in history, who started where? Depends on what story you want to believe and where you want to start that story, doesn't it? It's a socially constructed concept. Race, how about gender? What does it mean to be male? Well, you know, men are the kind of people that can do this, and women are the kind of people that can do this. And why, in some societies, whether it's in the American society, Western societies, or otherwise, are females paid less than males for doing the same amount of work in certain organizations? It's a socially constructed concept. Because of these broadly held, generalized other views. The same holds true for sexual orientation. The same holds true for socioeconomic class. Think about this for a moment. Let's assume for a moment that I make $50,000. I have a graduate degree, and I live in the suburbs, and I drive an SUV. Does that make me middle class? What if I make $51,000? Am I all of a sudden higher class? How we determine these things, again, broadly held social views. What constitutes class, socioeconomic class? What constitutes lower class, middle class, upper class? What are the definitions of such? Broadly held, generalized views. How in the world did we get there to those broadly held, constructed views? We learn them as we interact with others. We learn them through things like proverbs. What do I mean by proverbs? Wise sayings. Sayings that might be within our texts that are hundreds or thousands of years old that we rely upon for wisdom in this culture. So religious texts, maybe. We learn them from jokes. Jokes? How in the world would we learn them from jokes? Think about this for a minute. When we tell a joke about somebody who we want to make fun of, which means usually an out-group person, and we're in the in-group. So whether the out-group is a fan of a rival sports team, an ethnicity that we seem not to care for, a religion we seem to hold some prejudice against, somebody from another part of the world. What we're trying to do is suggest that what is funny is that they don't know the norms of what we see as common sense. So we make fun of an out-group member in an attempt to describe to us and to pass down to our friends, etc. And why it's funny is because we're also indicating what is proper accepted behavior. And if you can find that funny too, you recognize the behavior of this person who doesn't know, and perhaps we might say doesn't know any better, what proper accepted behavior might be. So jokes, lectures, teachers, especially your grade school teachers, did they not actually tell you how to behave in public, how to behave in a classroom? That's where we picked a lot of that up. Sermons, homilies, talks, depending upon where you are and if you are churchgoers and if you have a religious life and you attend a church, from the pulpit, Your religious leader is going to want to disseminate lessons of some kind as in some form of talk, and in essence tells us how to behave, or how they think we ought to behave, as such indicating the broader social society thinks this, and this is what we ought to be paying attention to. Folk tales, fairy tales, legends, heroes, or even probably mostly in the United States, for instance, television. How is it that we learn so much from watching situation comedies, for instance? Situation comedies tell us what? It's okay to be this way, and this way, but not that way. Situation comedies tell us that it's okay to have this problem, this problem, but not that problem. Situation comedies perhaps also tell us that if you can't figure out your problem within a half an hour, there's another problem. And so, television, the news is only putting on what that particular station thinks oftentimes is bad. You know, in the newspaper writing industry, in the news writing industry, for years when we had these classes, one of the things they taught all the newspaper people is if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, the more gruesome, the better the ratings because people want to see it. So how can we make whatever it is look bad? Again, we're trying to show what outside the acceptable limit behavior looks like, because otherwise we're recognizing what is in-group behavior. So we learn them through the media and institutions that reflect cultural values. We learn them through clubs that we sign up for and we decide to join. And so, and also we learn them, of course, through laws in our government. Other perspectives of self include that, when we talked about this a moment ago, that the self is multidimensional. The self is multidimensional. We have a physical self on how we view ourselves and our athletic prowess, perhaps. We have a cognitive self and what things we think are worth our thinking about. We have an emotional self and discuss with ourselves, for example, and decide how sensitive are we. We have an interactive self. And we are ever changing and ever in process. Now here's the interesting thing. If we are ever changing and ever in process, and much of what we just described with our self-concept may have started from the idea that we are an infant. We'll go back to the attachment styles idea. From the time we were born through our infancy, well, here's an interesting thing to think about and I want you to ponder. Somewhere around the age of 13, now that's give or take 13, okay, approximately 13, our ego has a tendency to take over. And when I talk about ego, I mean we have a tendency to assert our own thoughts and feelings upon our own identity. So, up until about 13, oftentimes we are absorbing the perspectives of others around us. And we take those in and we internalize them as part of our identity. And up until about the age of 13, our identity is constructed through the act of joining. And we don't always have the choice about what we're joining. When we're born, we join a family or a community of people collected somehow. When we join that family, the family lives on a particular block, we've already joined a neighborhood and a culture. As we begin to grow, we join our school class, a class of school children. We may or may not have the choice because our parents may just sign us up for it, see if we like it. Sport teams through school, clubs through school, things of this nature. We may or may not have the choice of what religion at that point we may be in because that's just what our family does. And so the church choice may not be ours either, and the fact that we're even going to church, the joining, may not have been our choice either. And so all the way up until about the age of 13, our identity might be classified under the concept of joining. But about the age of 13, our ego starts to overtake ourselves, and we start to recognize that, hey, I can control some of what I want to do. And so our identity often then becomes more characterized by splitting off, by quitting and joining something else, but here of our own choosing. I may decide at age 13, guess what, Mom? I really was never interested in the tuba and the marching band. I'm quitting that. And so now I'm being identified as one who once was a member of the marching band, but not currently. And I'm beginning to choose certain things for myself, whether it's I want to go this way with computers, or join this kind of club, or find my interest in archery that my parents never had an interest in before. But I start looking at things that allow me to split off from all the groups I joined before and begin to find my own. This is also the time where we might start doing things that seem really rebellious to our families. Decide I'm going to put various holes in my head or body, and then attach those holes with various bits of jewelry. Decide I'm going to see just how my endurance is with needle and ink on my skin, and go get tattoos. Decide I'm going to travel some without anybody's permission or any money or reservations, just go and see what happens. So about the age of 13, approximately, our ego starts to get more involved in our own choices, and we start to recognize that maybe my identity from joining, I'm splitting, and I'm going to go start looking and seeking my own way. So we talked about socially constructed views. Different cultures at different times. What does it mean to be female? You know what? 100 years ago it meant something very, very different than it does today. In the Middle East it means something very different than it does in the United States. So the society is socially constructed. Today when we talk about, now you may or may not agree with it, and I'm not asking you for your opinion at this point, but the fact is, today when we talk about married couples, the definitions of what that means is very drastically different and can be in its composition compared to what it was 20 years ago. And even more different 20 years ago than it was 100 years ago. As to what was considered normal or acceptable. Okay? Attitudes toward various drugs. Again, changing. Our societal perceptions are changing. Not everywhere all the time, but they are in the midst of evolving. We don't have to agree and like it, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the definition within society of what was acceptable behavior in these realms were very different than they are today. And as a consequence, we also have to recognize we also change. We are very dynamic. During our first discussion, we talked about why we're even having a discussion series in interpersonal communication anyway. We talked about the idea that it wouldn't make any sense to engage in such discussion if it wasn't possible to change, to improve interpersonal communication. And at the end of every one of these discussions, we talk about guidelines of what things we might consider doing with respect to wanting to change. And that's what we're going to look at today. In order to improve our self-concept and how we view ourselves, the first thing that we need to pay attention to is the idea of making a firm commitment to personal growth. That's not easy. Because one of the things that I talk about is that the fact that you are 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old, however old you are, is as many years as you have had to actually condition your brain into exactly the formulation that it is right now. And we know, for example, that people are creatures of habit, and we don't change very quickly. Habits die hard. And we also know that even the words we use, even with ourselves, change very slowly. We can't change everything our habits like that. And we also know that the mind will process action far more quickly than it will process negation. Think about that for a moment. The mind will process action far more quickly than it will process negation. So if I told you you could do anything you want in the next 20 minutes, just don't think of an apple. The likelihood is, if you are like many, immediately that went through your mind was something that represented an apple, whether it was a piece of fruit, a pie, a baseball game, or a computer. Something that represented apple went through your mind, and then you went, oh, wait a minute, he said don't, and then you changed the image to an orange or something else. What happens to those people, for example, in speech class, that are so afraid, and their physical manifestations of speech anxiety grasp them so heavily that they have such difficult time getting up in front of a group and even getting through a couple of lines? They say to themselves again and again, don't be nervous, don't be nervous, don't be nervous, don't be nervous. What are they programming themselves to be? Nervous. Exactly the opposite of what they want, because we know the mind will process action. Think of an apple. Be nervous. Far more quickly than it will process negation. Don't. Make a firm commitment to personal growth means essentially we've got to actually recognize this is not easy stuff. And we've got to look deep within ourselves and how we're actually formulating our own thoughts and our own perspectives about things as we go. Gain and use knowledge to support personal growth. You need to understand how your self-concept is formed. We've talked about them. Where do you see yourselves fitting in? Do you recognize yourselves in any of those scenarios we described? And if so, where? Because knowing where you are will certainly help figuring out where you need to start moving if you choose to change it. So you need information about yourself. Set goals that are realistic and fair. You're not going to change overnight. Step by step is required. And seek contacts that support personal change. Seek contacts that support personal change. Here's a secret. If you really want a good, clear understanding of your perceptions and how you really do look at life, look at the top 5 people you spend most of your time with. Look at the top 5 people you spend most of your time with. Because believe it or not, because you are constantly absorbed with all of their hearing and interacting with them, you are taking in all of their perceptions on how they view life, that you actually become a culmination, in large part, of the top 5 people you spend most of your time with. If you don't like the way you are and your perception about things right now, you might want to seriously consider replacing some of those people that you spend all your time with people who actually have attitudes and perceptions of the world that you want to adopt. Because you will then constantly be exposed to their perceptions and ways of thinking. Because if at first you don't succeed, remember, of course, that you found at least one way it didn't work. When we start looking at trying to learn more about ourselves, sometimes it's helpful to look and ask questions of other people. Be honest with ourselves and ask others what they also think of us. The concept here that we want to discuss is that of the Johari window, because there are 4 major areas of ourselves that are not equal by any means, although they're often illustrated as equal 4 sections in a window. The first is the open area. The open area is that area which is known to ourselves and also known to others. The fact that I'm wearing a blazer today is known to you because you can see it. It's also known to me because I know I put it on. My name is known to you and it's known to me. It's an open thing. How much is open of you to others that you can recognize this? The next area I want to talk about is the hidden area. It's unknown to others, but it's known to us. This is often the case when we talk about things that we're not proud of. Substance abuse, some things we might have done in our history, in our past, or things that we just would rather people not know for whatever reason. Hidden area. We know it, they don't. When I disclose it, it goes into the open area, doesn't it? This is why those 4 squares are never really equal in our lives. the blind area. It's unknown to me, but others know it. You know, I spent some time studying the psychophysiological measures of the detection of deception. And in so doing, I've often looked at people when I'm playing poker, for instance, and if I can tell they're bluffing because they have a tell, do you suspect there's any way I'm going to share that tell and my knowledge of their tell with them? I'm not that generous. And so there are things that are unknown to me, but others know. All right, I'm talking about one specific instance. What about the fact that I just had lunch before I came to give this presentation, and you're all sitting here looking at that really big green piece of spinach on the front of my teeth? I haven't got a clue that it's there. Again, blind. From the blind area. The other is the unknown area. Unknown to you and unknown to others. And people think, well, how can that be? I was with a group of doctors once and I asked that question. How can that be? Somebody give me an example. Because when I ask that question of other people, they often kind of sit there and go, I don't understand how that's possible. And one doctor raised his hand and he looked at me and he said, how about the undiagnosed cancer cell? Oh, wow. It's there. I don't know about it yet. You don't know about it yet because as a doctor you haven't done the test yet. But it's there. The undiagnosed cancer cell. Okay. So when we start looking at the idea of disclosure and trying to learn more about ourselves, as we learn more about ourselves, we can start making a game plan for this is how my self-concept has been built. This is what I might want to do to change it, and this is how I can go about changing it.